Hey, fellow G&Ters, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So we are talking about COVID. It's a passion topic of Daniel's to revisit COVID a little bit every year around what we might call COVID birthday time, COVID
Yeah,
anniversary time.
yeah.
Yeah,
COVIDversary.
yeah, yeah. Coined a phrase. It's gonna catch on like hotcakes. Um, and it could seem funny to be talking about events from years ago when the US is so like fucked up in the present, specifically on the eve when we're recording this of what could be a disastrous ground war with Iran that would look Vietnam look awesome. But the point, and I think this is a deep point that you have within the heart of this, Daniel, is that these current events that we're in are entwined with the sort of PTSD, COVID kind of thing, this sort of unresolved like trauma around these events. So last week we kind of introduced the subject. We talked about certain aspects of this, and this week, I think Daniel, from your side, you really want to focus on kind of two big ideas and wherever else the conversation takes us, but especially this notion of like decentralization and what happened with this, and
Yeah,
then also kind of like the difference between being in a me state and a we state as a, kind of that notion, right? Are we in a me time or a we time, and what's going to happen with that? So I'll throw the mic over to
yeah,
you. I'm curious to hear what you got in terms of these
yeah,
notions, and yeah, thanks for sharing it.
yeah. No, of course. Thanks. And audience, the audience, thanks so
Oh,
much
I forgot to do the
for
thing.
tuning
Yeah.
in. We appreciate it. Smash that like button, hit the hype button if it's available for you. Subscribe, all that other kind of stuff. Our work is free. So we like audience interaction and we like, people sharing things and whatever. So comment, send us a question or, comment, all of that. It helps the show grow and for other people to see it and hear it as well. So thank you so much ahead of time. Without further delay. So yeah, Eric brought this idea up of decentralization, and we're going to talk about that in a number of different facets as what occurred essentially during COVID. But one of the things that I want to clarify is that like that time period, COVID did not necessarily cause it. I think COVID accelerated what was already kind of happening. And like anything in life, you're going to get a boomerang effect. So that's where we'll end up talking about this like me and we scenario. So we're talking about decentralization then. What avenues of life became decentralized? And there's a couple ones here, and Eric, feel free to jump in at any point, right? Work, people doing remote work, and not just like remote working out of the office, but like really remote, like moving away, living in, there's a lot of people, if you remember during COVID, were like getting these vans and like living in the middle of nowhere and working from satellite and on, so that was one of the things. But then the boomerang effect to that is that then it was like, oh no, everybody's coming back to work. That online shit is dead. We're not doing that anymore. Or if we are, we're doing it one day, and it became a much larger control over it. Whereas before, people were talking about 4 day work weeks actually for quite some time. In terms of commuting and things like this, it's just more effective to work 4 10-hour days than 5 8-hour days. Those conversations are not occurring anymore.
I think the two words that jump out to me in that was like the word control, that there was sort of a reasserting of control, right?
Hmm.
So like in some ways control kind of like I don't want to say totally faltered, but slightly faltered, lost some of
Yeah.
its things went kind of out of control. And then it was like, well, no,
Yeah.
no, we're reasserting that. And then I think on that part, there was a big debate about like productivity, right? Wait a minute, we're really
Hmm.
super productive. What the fuck? We don't have to work as much. We don't have to do this as much. And
Hmm.
then like that got to be a risky proposition too, because the next thing you know,
Hmm.
once you have to acknowledge that, well, maybe I should only have to work this number of hours a week. Look at my
Hmm.
productivity. And the control mechanism is no, we're not going to let you get away with that either.
Correct.
Let alone that you might ask for some more money. No, the answer is no.
Hmm.
And things went back to like full on grind in the aftermath of that. Actually, that's a kind of a big ricochet in the way that you're framing it. It was like, no, we're not doing that.
Hmm.
And we're not even going to acknowledge that that's even a thing. Yeah.
No, no,
Yeah.
we're letting that go.
Yeah.
And so we talked a little bit then about the sort of geographical decentralization. A lot of people left large cities because they could be remote and enjoyed that. You had like the move to the suburbs, which had affecting on housing prices and stuff like this, and then the movement of people to other cities, right? That weren't necessarily as popular before, all of a sudden became super popular. So in Montana, like Billings and Bozeman, other places, like you can call them blue cities and red states, right? So Austin, Nashville, these places where people are like, oh, I want a different kind of environment, but then other suburbs around those areas too that were not maybe as popular before, all of a sudden now had this like influx of people that weren't there previously. Another aspect of this is like the decentralization of information. We touched on this a little bit last week, actually quite a bit, and so I'm not going to talk too much about it now, other than to just highlight that the decentralization of information really is a movement away towards like traditional news programs, they call like linear TV. So in the beginning of COVID, you had maybe Netflix, and by the end of it, there's like as the Bay Area word hella. You had hella streaming pop options for yourself to the point where like streaming, if you have all the streaming options, your bill is going to be way more than cable ever was.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
Everyone's debating that. I want to watch this one thing that's going to cost me $15 a month or something like that to do it.
Right,
I gotta
right.
watch. We talked about it a little bit off mic. This is like this the light conversation of the thing, but I gotta watch the second season of Daredevil, Born Again. Is
Born
that what it
again.
is? Yeah.
Yes.
And again, our reviews first season. It's reasons, but anyways, I'm recatching little bits of the first season, watch the second season, and yeah, you're like, how much is this Disney going to cost me to
Right.
watch this show? Yeah, but I think during COVID, it was like, I never watched any of that stuff, but like people that you don't want to just sit around and watch like Lizard King, wasn't that wasn't that a COVID thing?
Tiger King?
Tiger King. Lizard
Yeah,
King is Jim
Lizard.
Morrison from The Doors. No one gives a shit about that. Tiger
No.
King. That was the one.
Yeah.
And there was other shit like that. That was like completely COVID time stuff. I guess when they do the 20 years from now, when all the Gen Zers want to watch nostalgic shit about this,
Right.
they can watch that. Um, I guess, like just I'll go back, I'll give some feedback on some of the stuff you shared too. The city thing is kind of interesting. I guess we'll get to it, but I was listening to Robert Pape, who's a University of Chicago professor and an expert on like military things and political things, because I'm keeping track of the war stuff.
Hmm.
And interesting with your decentralization, he's talking like, I guess he's writing a whole book about it, but fragmentation,
Yeah.
that thing's fragmented. So
That's another way of putting
similar
it.
vocab. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Fragmentation, even a little bit more ominous sounding or something, right?
probably.
Yeah. And with the idea that like even in these areas that would have otherwise be like red states, if you start getting a bunch of blue people in these red states, there's tension, right? There's
Hmm.
real tension over that.
Hmm.
So, anyways, it just hit me from what you were talking about.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so the decentralization of information is that people then going to podcasts and online sources and various news outlets that before had a following, but then all of a sudden they can break off and create their own media. So you had like on the Ben Shapiro became infinitely more popular. And look at Tucker Carlson left Fox News, got his own thing. Candace Owens got her own thing. Mehdi Hassan started Zateo, and you had Kyle and Crystal and Sagar left The Hill and went and started Breaking Point. So, you have a bunch of different people that left what you would consider larger things and started their own thing and did well and like quickly. It didn't take like years like how it used to take years to build a following. You went viral a couple times and all of a sudden, you have a 500,000 subscribers and now you're on your way to really doing it. So, and they're garnering views. These are people who are not on quote unquote TV. They're on YouTube and they're on, whatever, maybe Substack or Rumble or whatever it is that they're doing their thing on. But lots of people view their stuff and that's their source of information. So information now is no longer, primarily sourced on traditional television. It's definitely far more independent or decentralized as the word that I'm using here. Is that
I think that was like, I think you're right in the time frame on that. If I get a little autobiographic, maybe, because I
mm-hmm.
think like at some point during Trump 1, there got to be this weird effect, like I better get like some different perspectives on what's going on here. And things begin to kind of like spread out. So you can tell,
Mm-hmm.
like, as I guess as it runs through, the toxicity in the culture was already sort of there, like fermenting and fomenting, I guess. Those could be the two
Mm-hmm.
words you could use. And then it like
Mm-hmm.
exploded during this crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But the seeds were already kind of planted. And I know if I look back at my own way, I was like taking in things. All of a sudden, everything got much more broad because I needed other ways of seeing the world. Like what was happening from standard sources just didn't seem sufficient anymore. So, anyways,
Mm-hmm.
probably all of us have
Mm-hmm.
our own autobiographical tales around that. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And then the last kind of part before we do the other side would be like education. You have tons and tons of people who are, what you would consider influencers, right? That are selling you supplements or selling you coaching or selling you, and coaching is like that's education online. They call it coaching, right? But it could be business coaching, health coaching, life coaching, any kind of, spiritual coaching, astrological, all sorts of stuff. Like that whole industry exploded, exploded with experts. And these people are not traditionally trained. They don't have like a classic education in X, Y, or Z. They're sort of people with experience, self-proclaimed experts, and then once you have a large enough following, then you have market share. That's kind of how and that people spend money and time on this kind of a thing, and they look to it as it's entrepreneurial for sure. So I'm not, if it sounds like I'm bashing it, I'm not. I'm just saying that did not exist in the same way that it did before, where people would go and seek and spend 8, 10, 15, 20,000, and these regular people on different kinds of, what I'm calling coaching, but really we could say is education, you know, that wasn't present in the way that it was prior to the really the more permanent move online, right? Our lives permanently moved online during this time, and this was definitely one of the things that came out of it.
yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, like my son's like he's a little chess player. I guess you'd say he's a little chess prodigy. I don't know if like something like that. I got like a little chess thing in his room behind me where I do this pod. And a lot of that became like online chess education stuff was such a big
Mm-hmm.
thing, for like
Mm-hmm.
the little rugrats who were learning their things during that time period because he was like second grader or something in that window of time, right? And like I guess what you're saying is like education in some ways and that information around that kind of decentralized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, well, I guess some commentary on that since we're doing like a back and forth and I'll throw some things out and you can give me what you think about this. But I think that's part of like Maha, isn't it? Didn't that
Yeah.
translate into the Maha thing? And that's the mixed bag of this, I suppose, right? On the one hand, you can get like new sources of things that can be inspiring or interesting or things you wouldn't otherwise have access to. On the other side, you can get a whole bunch of like quackery level shit out that can flood out. And I guess, I mean, if you want to look at the positives and the negatives, I guess that would be Maha. And Maha, like probably no bueno, probably bad, right?
Mm.
And so you get like those kinds of problems that come out of that, which was like based in a kind of a entrepreneurialism. You're framing the positive side of it. I'll frame, I guess, the negative side of it on some level. Because the minute you get into that kind of stuff, you get a lot of quack shit out.
Yeah.
And it's like there's a real problem with like quackery.
It's the distrust of institutional knowledge, the distrust of institutional information. And it's highlighted most poignantly with like this education and healthcare piece. Because during that period was, all these experts and everybody who went to school and should know about, not epistemology, but virology and public health and so on.
Ecology.
Yeah,
Yeah.
epistemology. Yeah. Like we should know about this. And yet they were wrong or intentionally hiding or people realize that experts are human beings and that they make mistakes as well. And
There
so
was
they said,
extraordinary circumstances where there was like, you know, that's a weird situation. I didn't mean to talk over you. I'm sorry, but that's a weird situation, isn't it? Right? We're
I
medical people. All of a
I
sudden,
would
you're like,
agree.
man, this is fucked up. What are we going to do? And yet you still have to project some kind of confidence that you don't really have the right to
Yes.
claim. It was totally fucked up. Agreed.
Right. But people who might hear this who are more on the conspiratorial side, which we are, might say, well, we're covering for people who are trying to lead society in a certain way. I am not necessarily doing that. I'm just saying people make mistakes. And you're under a lot of, like you said, you're under a lot of pressure. Those people were under a lot of pressure, and who knows what the pressure where the pressure was coming from, what the pressure was on to try and move the public health in a certain way. I'm not sure. I'm just saying that I'm not here to give a judgment on it. I'm here to just to call what occurred, and the fragmentation of that, as you used earlier, definitely occurred.
Or like a weird mix. Some people were honest actors who were under duress trying to do the best they can under extraordinary medical circumstances, and some of those people were sneaky motherfuckers
Yes.
who were like doing things that were questionable. And it like stretches across like a wide gamut of people, right? I mean, we talked
Yeah.
about in the last episode, some of that stuff around COVID information control of what would be sources that you might say were more on the left, and we try to be fair, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anti-Trump. There's no doubt. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not, but I'll also call things on both sides when it's wrong. And there was some
Totally.
devious stuff around some of those actors, like an Anthony
Mm-hmm.
Fauci. If you want to like look at it objectively,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
weird because he like flashing back to COVID times. There was a bakery up the street where they were doing like Anthony Fauci themed cupcakes and stuff, trying to like get people to like be positive towards him. And at the time, it seemed funny and cool or whatever. And you look back at it and you're like, you want to spit out your Anthony Fauci cupcake because it turned out that he was a fraud in many
Right.
ways. And we can self-research this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there were some devious things going on. Before we totally give up the quackery thing, okay, I'm gonna give
Mm.
hot take. You might not like this take, Danielle. We'll see. But like it's like the Professor Zhang world too. Uh-oh, I'm going there. I'm going to say it. He's kind of quacky, right?
Mm.
And I it's a very painful thing on some level because I admire his story. If you don't know him, he's like superstar exploding. He's kind of like the Jordan Peterson of the moment or something,
Totally.
taking
Yeah.
like a grand rocket ship.
Yeah.
There's like some news shows I listen to, like a Breaking Points you mentioned earlier, with Cristobal Sagar and Jetty and other people. Ryan Grimm, also really
Mm-hmm.
awesome on that thing. So yeah, I think a kind of a nice news show with a diversity of
Mm-hmm.
opinion on it. And I think their episode with Professor Zhang like exploded to like 10 million views or some
Yes,
crazy shit.
that's their highest view of
Yeah.
interview ever.
And so I decided to listen. And again, I find his story very moving. He was a guy who was Chinese descent, ended up growing up in Canada, faced a lot of like hostility as kind of a Chinese kid growing up in Canada, kind of poor, eventually got into Yale. And I was like, oh, this is a nice story. I kind of resonate with that part. And
Mm-hmm.
then, and he has his predictive stuff and,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, he tries to do these predictive history things. And some of it's really fucking quacky. So, anyways, hot take for what it's worth. But you're like, man, this is some quacky ass shit, because he'll get to the
Yeah.
point where he's like, uh, uh, oh God, the Rosicrucians and and the
Yeah, I mean
Jesuits
he
are
believes
in a
yeah,
secret society that are going to try
he
to take over the world. And you're like, dude, come on.
well
And then he
he
was on
believes
like,
in
yeah.
he believes in the occult. He still does. But anyways, I disagree. We're moving on.
Now I'm
Um
going to do one more thing because then he's on Tucker Carlson and he's going on about like the Great Replacement theory. I'm going to call it. We can drop it then, Daniel.
yeah,
But
yeah.
he's,
I
he's
mean,
doing Great Replacement on Tucker. I'm calling it. Jordan Peterson. Ha, called. Anyways, we'll let it go.
yeah. Well, yeah, he is not white, but
I'm
he's Chinese.
he's going to call that like Western culture is replacing itself. That's his call on Tucker Carlson. Check it out for yourself, dear
Yeah.
listeners.
Yeah, I mean,
And you
yeah.
can see he's a quack.
I've listened to like probably 20 hours of his lectures. So I feel pretty confident in my view of him, but we're not going there. Um anyways,
Okay.
I personally think that anytime you're
I've,
going to
I've
make
done the I've done the listen to now, so I caught up.
yeah,
Not 20 hours, but I've caught up.
yeah, I've listened to
Okay.
many lectures. I mean, anytime you're going to do predictive stuff, you're going to be right on some, you're going to be wrong a lot, but he tends to be right on a lot of different things. And I think
I
that
will make predictive history. As we go forward, it'll get more and more devious and you'll like it less and less. That's my prediction.
that's fair. That's
Professor
fair.
Eric. made a
That's
prediction.
that's fair.
It'll get
That's fair.
creepier and creepier as it goes. But okay, we'll dive.
Okay, so the boomerang then the opposite of this stuff of the decentralization where we could say might have some positive attributes, the kind of like the societal response, the structural response, the institutional response is control. And the control comes in a few forms, but one of which is like the dominance of tech. And if you look at this even from like an S&P perspective, I mean, the market is only up because of like the Magnificent Seven. Other than that, 1%. I mean, it was before the war, up like 1% year over year. That's nothing. So you're talking 490 companies, an increase of 1% year over year, right? So that dominance is not only in the financial sector, but it's in the use case sector of normal citizens, right? So our reliance on these platforms has gone up dramatically, has gone up. I know to the point where they're almost like institutions. Like Amazon is almost an institution. They do so much commerce, like you almost have to use them in order to compete at this point. So
Or just
whereas it,
in the world almost, right? You almost can't live without it, kind of, right?
yes, but if you're trying to sell, you know,
Yeah, okay, you're going from that point of view too. But even as a
yeah,
consumer, it's hard to get around it on some level, right?
sure.
Yeah.
And so what it is essentially is like it's a middleman. And the middlemen now have like inserted themselves into what it is that we are trying to do, which live and consume and whatever that case is. So, and where that once was like a luxury, like you said, it's become far more of almost like a necessity.
Do you
And
see that as like kind of a paradox of centralization, decentralization? Because they're kind of centralizing power. So you're getting kind of a paradoxical effect here.
yes,
That's
that's
how
the
you see it.
boomerang.
Okay.
That's the
All right.
boomerang.
Oh, gotcha.
That's
Gotcha.
exactly
Okay.
what
I
happened.
see. And the idea that
So
that was going on beforehand, but now it's like accelerated
totally,
due to the chaos of that time and how much people had to rely on these tools, right? Everything got taught. Okay, I get it.
you got it. Okay, good.
Yeah,
You're smelling me now. Yeah.
yeah.
And then obviously government expansion. So you had like the mask mandates and all those other kind of like controls that were implemented and then were moved away, but at the same time, this kind of like I mean, hell, we don't gotta be bullshit. Like there's people on the streets, stealing other human beings and putting them in camps. And those camps are owned by jail people. They're owned by the prison lobby. I like that's the other side of it. The other side of that this is the other thing, right? And
And that's
it's
part of your boomerang idea that there was like this
absolutely
idea that all of a sudden we're going to clamp down
we're gonna
control.
clamp down.
So things got, it's almost like, I was thinking about it earlier, it's almost like the snow globe got shook. Everything got like up in the
Hmm.
air, and all of us is like, nope, nope, nope. Whoosh, we're going to push
Well,
everything back under some kind of
yes.
more control.
Yeah, and if you kind of mix that in with the business sector with corporations, you look at and you tying this back with the tech piece, there's the implementation of AI. What's the big scare about it, right? Is surveillance and data, right? And the profiling of the citizens who live here to be controlled so that they know who their opposition is and what they're saying, what they're doing, if there's any kind of, movement or anything else against the regime. This is the total opposite of freedom. This is the complete and utter revolution against that, anti-revolution, if you want to call it.
Yeah, it was sort of like, again, there's like someone who lived in Chicago over 2025. And if you haven't been in the city where this has happened yet, once you got all the ICE authorities that like invaded in Chicago, I remember like talking with friends going, there's helicopters here constantly, y'all,
Yeah.
all the time. They're flying over my neighborhood all the time. And as I live in a decently bougie neighborhood, but they were like flying like incessantly. And I remember talking with people who live like not in the city proper, but out in the suburbs. And I was going like, I can't tell you how many helicopters are flying over my neighborhood. And I'd be
Hmm.
talking to a friend on the phone, and there'd be like three or four of them. I got
Yeah.
one friend who's really into the whole tech world. That's part of his professional life. And he was like, they're just surveilling you.
Hmm.
All they're doing. They're just collecting information and surveilling you. So they'll know where they're pinging everybody's phones. So they want to know where people are. And it's all just sort of that oracle, or what's the Palantir? Ah,
Yeah.
Palantir. those surveillance and, companies that are like tied into the federal government. Yeah.
Yeah. So that, and so basically, and then the last kind of other one we talked about the decentralization of media. But the opposite to that is that you have essentially, one person now or one conglomerate that owns, they're buying Warner Brothers, they own Paramount, they own TikTok, it's one, that's a monopoly. That's all one entity that owns all of those things. Yes, that's not
And not
everything.
disentangled from the state.
No, not disentangled at all. So so on one hand, people are going away from these things, but then on the other hand, these things are consolidating and they're trying to infiltrate downwards, to try and capture more attention, which, as I've said before, is the most valuable commodity today by a long shot. Not Bitcoin, not Dogecoin, your attention. So anyway, so that's the boomerang effect. That's what's occurred. That's
For
why we
people
are where we are.
for people who don't know, that whole thing of like CBS and who else is it? Paramount's under that umbrella. They're acquiring Warner Brothers, right?
Paramount, yes, is
And
acquiring
so
Warner
it's all
Brothers.
under that. And that's like being owned under this kind of very right-wing kind of ownership. If you don't know the backstory, you can do a little research for yourself there,
Yeah.
listener, but you can go further and you can kind of see how that happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
With a
Mm-hmm.
lot of this sort of consolidation. That's a very interesting question. Like in a fragmented world, how much benefit will you get out of doing that to like try to like I don't know what I think about that. Influence and manipulate people. If you own CBS, does anyone care anymore? Can you influence people through that or not? It's not like we were talking a little bit, maybe Noam Chomsky stuff earlier. Again, kind of a character that's a little bit harder to talk about now because of his connection to the Epstein files.
Right.
But, still like obviously you can't discredit everything the guy did because of, uh, that part. Though I don't know how serious that part is. We
We
can
don't know.
debate. But in any case, there were things he produced that did have value, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole manufacturing consent idea is the
Mm-hmm.
tension here, right? So this is a very
That,
famous
yes.
book. And his whole point was that when you get these cultural centralized institutions, they'll try to force and manufacture consent,
Mm-hmm.
kind of get everyone's, like you're saying, the most valuable commodity is your mind, right? So
Correct.
try to get the mind and we'll try to force that all going in some direction. That's his famous concept. So it's a kind of there's a weird tension there, isn't there? And I don't know how this fits into your
Yeah.
framing of it, but
That
like
exactly.
in a
It fits.
certain sense,
That's
there's dispersed opportunities to hear different things, and then there's this massive kind of thing of trying to like reconsolidate and force. And it's very bizarre times for that reason, right?
and that brings us to our article from the Harvard Gazette,
Ah,
written by Brett Milano in February of 2021. And this is a discussion on this. We talked about this at the beginning of the show, this movement from me to we or we to me. So if we think about this from a societal perspective, right, we're talking about these forces of like divergence and convergence. Okay. So we think about post World War II, it's the New Deal. It's an expansion of the suburbs and people who want to procreate, and communities are suburbs. Like everybody comes back and they want to like live and build and do stuff. Very community focused.
that kind of thing that started in the 30s, going to the 40s and afterwards. This idea of like this is a time of like shared collective action on some level, right?
Correct. And
The
you
we
can
time.
include this, you can include the civil rights movement in that as well.
Eventually, it
You know?
stretches forward, right? Yeah.
hmm And then, this article probably says it starts to shift in like the 80s and move more towards me, and then especially when we start getting into the 90s with technology, with cell phones, and then eventually the internet, and you start moving more into the 2000s, then it just accelerates now because you have a place to be platformed essentially, you know. And then really like this article talks about the crash of 2008 is like that's the foot on the pedal. That's your cell phone, that's everything. It's all about, because you can't trust the institutions to run themselves, right? We had seen at that point a number of really high profile thievery essentially from people's 401ks, Enron being one of them. What's the other guy? Bernie Madoff, right? So you,
Madoff is like a little bit earlier in time, but yeah, the corruption in the business world, right?
yes. And so you're not
Enron was
like,
like, depends on your age range, but Enron crashed you out financially if you happened to be alive during that time period, right?
yeah,
That
yeah,
shit, that's real. Enron was real. And then by the time 2008 happened, that was obviously the most real of reals. We'll see what 2026, 27 is. Yeah.
yeah.
But
You
yeah, those are
know,
times when you really can be shaken because you realize how fragile the economic underpinning is. And
right. And so it became far more individualistic then at that point, and moving forward. And so the idea is that we are in the sort of apex now of this me time with, again, the decentralization or the acceleration of the fragmentation post COVID moved us into this place again where you're thinking about yourself. And Eric, we had kind of talked about this before we started recording, but the sort of individualistic idea on an existential crisis, meaning COVID in particular, that people were starting to rethink things, but they were rethinking things for themselves. So we had a brief moment of we during COVID where people were living in like, or trying to exist in pods, right? People you were sort of exposed to, right?
it was kind of like, this is kind of interesting to use the phrase, but it was sort of like a little bit of a rally around the flag for a little window of time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like I remember watching there, if we go through our COVID nostalgia or something, if we can say such a thing. But I remember seeing, I can't remember, maybe it was in Italy or something. Everyone was under lockdown. And all
Mm-hmm.
the people got on their balconies, in the courtyards, and they all started like singing together, like the same
Yeah,
songs. And it was kind of touching on some level, right?
yeah,
Where there was this little thing of like a potential bonding.
yeah,
I can say, we're honest, I can say for the United States, because we had such a divisive person at the top of our hierarchy, DJT is so fucking divisive, like purposely so,
yeah,
that you couldn't rally. There was no possibility to rally because he was going to make everything divisive in the end, anyways. He's just a divisive person, right? As a strategy, it's his whole mind is like that. He's demented, obviously. But like,
yeah,
it was like you couldn't hold on to it on some level, but there was that feeling, and then they got like the political momentum, as you would say, fragmented or
mm-hmm,
decentralized, or whatever you want to say, because all of a
mm-hmm,
sudden it was all of this oppositional stuff became like standard. Everything had to be pitted against one another in that.
mm-hmm.
Or maybe if you had like an FDR type character, you went back to the New Deal, maybe things would have been different. It's possible, right? A
Yeah,
uniter of people as opposed to a divider. But at
yeah,
least as far as the experience here was, and I remember thinking this at the time, okay, this should be a time when people should be rallying together, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
even like W rallied people together after 9/11,
yeah,
right? He rallied people, as a kind of a leader that we would say is a very questionable figure now. But at least he was trying to rally people, but there wasn't really that wasn't going to happen. And I know
no,
it could have been different, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. You had
yeah.
President Bernie,
Oh, well,
would have been different. And that's, I
very
guess,
different.
I find interesting your idea to the tension of that, because you could see people will sometimes be trying to surge towards a we thing,
Mm-hmm,
even in a me time. I mean, I remember a lot of students I was talking to during the Bernie times, right? Bernie Sanders, right?
mm-hmm.
And people were trying to like rally around this collective idea, with him being sort of a figurehead representing it. Does that make sense to you, Daniel? You get
Yeah,
that tension, right?
yeah,
So a tension between the centralization, decentralization, and the tension between the me's and the we's of things, right?
mm-hmm.
Because even in like that was I mean, I think I can't remember, were we on campus together during that time? I know some people we're friends with were there because I remember specifically those conversations.
Yeah,
You
no, yeah, I wasn't there.
Yeah, you were already gone and done.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm getting my timeline, but there's another person I remember talking about this who we both know, right?
yeah. I
And
feel,
no, there
go
was a
ahead.
lot of that thing of people trying to say, okay, let's fight against this and let's get collective again. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
I
Occupy Wall
feel,
Street was like that too. Anyways, yeah.
yeah, well, part of that so that kind of ties in with what I'm saying. I feel like times of economic prosperity on the whole end up creating me civilization, me cultures. Times of economic discomfort create we because of the necessity for other people. And we do have to do a bit of our spirituality twist on things because this is the kind of a philosophical, psychological, psychospiritual podcast that reliance on other people is a very natural state in my opinion. I mean, I think that's how we survived and evolved as a species is by relying on each other. And then this illusion of independence really is an illusion because as we've talked about many, 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 many times before, things go in cycles, everything comes to an end, something starts anew, and that thing comes to an end. And as this phase of individualism seems to be coming to an end, just given the uncertainty of what's coming, with all the various factors on the war front and the economic front and with AI. I mean, people are still here. They're not going anywhere. And it might end up getting a little bit more difficult for people to survive. So we really do need each other, and how society is going to look coming up pretty soon. I have no idea. Nobody ever really knows. I'm not going to make any predictive history type of,
That's
declarations.
good. You're going to avoid quackery. Good. I tease.
But I can say that we are always, always, always stronger together, always in every scenario, you know, in every scenario, that's the case. And the understanding of that throughout this, is I think an important takeaway.
Well, it's like part of like Buddhist wisdom, right? Or,
Mm,
Taoist wisdom, we kind of like frame it in two ways. I don't always feel as close to the Evo Psych version, but you could say evolutionarily evolving, or we know there's all those exercises meditatively. As we get to the end of this podcast, we'll try to pull it into something spiritual. You're right. But you do these exercises of imagining like connecting your heart or, what you call your heart chakra or something, right? But that feeling you have, of the center of your chest, this emotional point of connection. You try to
hmm
imagine connecting with all the other beings around you. And it's an imagination, but it's also trying to uncover, a spiritual truth, right? Which is you are interconnected with all the other beings around you, right?
hmm
And when you
hmm
don't think of that interconnectivity, you're in a position of ignorance.
Yes.
It's part of the fundamental spiritual ignorance that, like, you see in the great spiritual teachings, they keep trying to point out you're not an isolated entity, you're entwined with
Yes.
the rest of the things around you. And it is really interesting. Yeah, you frame this in all these interesting ways. Thanks, Daniel. When you look at that, if you think of things not being interconnected and you go stumbling around the world around you, it's damaging because you're operating from a fundamental place of ignorance, right?
Yes.
And you don't see the interconnectivity of the things that you're doing. I mean, we don't want to dwell on it because it's not the point of the episode, but even if you're going to start a war and you don't see what the downstream effects of those things are going to be, you're in a point of ignorance.
Well,
You're not seeing
also,
the interconnectivity of how all those events are going to entwine with other things and other people and other impacts, right?
also don't do it by yourself.
It's illusory. Yeah. Yeah.
Surprise. I mean, like, if you want to go beat somebody up, better to do it with your buddies than to do it on your own.
Get anybody's left.
Well, yeah, that's
You're
right.
smart enough to realize that you need some buddies.
You need buddies.
Yeah. To realize that there's interconnectivity. But it's a kind of amazing thing to watch this. And I guess it can apply to any of the processes that you've been sharing this time.
hmm
But when you stumble through from this point of ignorance, you're going to make a mess of all kinds of things because you just don't see the interconnectivity around you. It's a
Yes.
profound point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And even if you think you can re-centralize control over everyone, can you really do that? Can you re-centralize control in such a like inclusive way that you're going to like dominate over this whole other interconnected collective? That doesn't seem very wise.
No.
It seems like you're operating from a place of ignorance, right?
Freedom and control stand on opposite ends of the spectrum to each other.
Yeah, I think that's right. That was I mean, I had mentioned this Robert Kagan guy last episode. I'm kind of wrapping up his book. He calls it liberalism versus anti-liberalism. It becomes a certain point where you realize you could put different phrases into these things and capture the same concept, right?
hmm hmm
But I do find this concept like fascinating, what you're saying, freedom and
hmm
control.
Yeah.
And freedom from what you're saying, me and we, doesn't mean that it means that I'm not interconnected with the things around me. That's not freedom either, right? So both of the concepts are really interesting, right?
Yes.
Yeah. like part of my freedom is also recognizing like, okay, I have to express my own authenticity. I have to pursue my spiritual path and develop myself, but that also is going to have a reverberating impact on others around me because I'm
For
not an
sure.
independent entity. And my being able to like express my own, whatever you want to call it, authenticity and more true spirit or something like that,
We've
you
said
know,
it many
gonna like,
times.
yeah, it's going to have this impact on others. Yeah.
I love the term that Lama Glenn uses, and I don't know if he coined it or not, but it's great. Localized phenomenon. We are uh, individual localized phenomenon. I just find that to be the best description for someone and their identity.
Yeah, this is like Glenn H. Mullen Lama Glenn, one of our beloved like Buddhist tantric teachers, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, and this idea of well, like he'll drop the Einstein quote too, optical illusion.
Yes.
The
Yes.
optical illusion of thinking that you're separate from the things around you, even on that very basic like physics level of things, is an optical
Hmm.
illusion. So of course all this stuff is illusory. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Uh,
there's a
yeah.
there's a cohesive force. There's tension between these two things, right? Between freedom, independence, decentralization, and then the controlling aspects and the dominance and the things that desire your dependency upon them. There's they're on opposite sides, but then there's the people who combine it together. Because without us, the institutions are nothing. There's no such thing as an institution without people who work in it, you know. And there is not freedom is a concept without the being that is attempting to attain it, or strive towards it.
Yeah, freedom like is an abstract idea. Doesn't That's a Zen almost thing, right? Okay, if you
Hmm.
just have a concept, that doesn't mean that much. If you can't embody it, right?
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
has to be embodied in some way. I guess, as we get to the end of the episode, I'm willing to be, this is the little Gnostic piece of me. I'm willing to be suspicious of centralized forces because most
Of
of the time
course.
they're not working for your individual best interests or the interest of all the beings that are interconnected with you. They're working for their own best interest.
Mm,
And that's the whole Gnostic concept, right? The archon,
yeah.
right? That's sort of in a way kind of parasitic and predatory.
Yeah.
Or like what you said a couple of episodes ago when we were talking this through, the Epstein class concept, right?
Hmm.
Predatory and parasitic, right?
Hmm.
Which is a position of spiritual ignorance. Because ultimately, if you want to follow these things through, it might seem like it's working well for you for a certain amount of time, but ultimately it won't. But obviously, for a time being, you can try to create dominance over others. It's ignorant, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting
Well,
episode. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel.
yeah, I mean, I feel the drive inside of me to say something of value at the end in summation, but actually there is nothing in summation. It's just it's a not just, but this is an observation of things moving back and forth in flow with each other. One side, the other side, tension, relaxation, and then trying to find that binding force in the middle. And I think people have to decide for themselves how they see things. And maybe you agree with the way that I frame things, maybe you disagree with the way that I frame things, but the larger point is to find out what it is that you think about these things because these things are happening. They're happening on a multitude of scales as we've talked about, both individually and, collectively, societally, institutionally, however you want to call it. And you really have to kind of decide for yourself, what is it that you want to be influenced by? What don't you want to be influenced by? Where do you feel like you have more freedom? Where do you feel like you don't? Are you moving in which direction are you moving in? Like you have to be intentional about things because there's plenty of other people and forces that are definitely being intentional around you. So, take some ownership, or at least as much as you can, with the choices that you do have available for yourself.
And maybe like the podcast point would be something like we're trying to be educational. That's like our intention, right?
Yeah,
And like the more you learn, the more you know. Is that the old thing?
that's it.
Yeah. The more you know, the more you're able to be empowered to make these decisions in a conscious and
Yes.
thoughtful way. And maybe the other way of saying what you're saying is if you don't make these decisions in a thoughtful and conscious way, other people will make these decisions for you.
They already are.
Yep. They definitely try and yeah.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
All right. Thanks so
Well,
much, Daniel.
yeah. As always, thanks for rocking. Audience, thanks for tuning in. If you made it to this point of the episode, you're amazing. That's it. Please feel free to send us an email at ginandtantra@gmail.com. Hit us up on the gram, the Gin and Tantra Podcast. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, share an episode, do all the things. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys at the next one. Peace.